The crucifixion is the most significant event in the history of man, when God's Son, Jesus Christ, died so that we may be saved. Since that day, people have struggled to prove to themselves and others that the events described in the Bible really happened. Yet there remains only one real piece of concrete physical evidence for us to look to in order to discover the true face of Jesus. The Shroud of Turin is said to be the burial cloth of Jesus, and it is at once the most controversial and talked about artefact on the planet. Analysed for hundreds of years by scholars and scientists, many believe that the shroud holds the key to proving once and for all that Jesus died for our sins, just as described in the Bible. Now we believe we can do just that, with the help of some sceptical scientists, a brilliant chemist, and the man who photographed the shroud over 30 years ago and was so touched by the experience that he rededicated the rest of his life to spreading the message of the shroud as far and wide as possible.
And then he said, look, Barry, let me give you some advice. Go to Turin, do the best job you can. One day you'll know why, because God doesn't tell you in advance what the plan is.
Join us as we embark on a journey to uncover the truth about the Shroud of Turin and the true face of Jesus Christ.
Unless I see the scars of the nails in his hands, and put my finger on those scars, and my hand in his side, I will not believe.
The world is full of doubting Thomases, people who need to see with their own eyes the physical proof of things that others are willing to believe on faith alone. Seek and ye shall find, said Jesus. And it was in the spirit that the Shroud of Turin research project set out in 1978 to try to uncover the truth about the shroud. Dozens of the world's best scientists from the Los Alamos National Scientific Laboratories in the US, Air Force Academy and NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, amongst others, converged on Turin, where they spent 120 hours running over 1,000 tests and taking over 30,000 photographs of the cloth in which Jesus was buried. Amongst them was expert photographer Barry Schwartz.
Of course, I founded SHROUD.com 12 years ago in 1996, and that website has grown to become the largest and the oldest and probably the most relevant website on the Shroud of Turin on the entire internet. And the reason for that simply is that I have no bias from a Christian or non-Christian point of view. I can stick to the science, I can stick to the facts.
Barry Schwartz, like many of the scientists on the Shroud research team, was a skeptic. He was in Turin as a professional just doing his job. But what the team found when they got there was to change their lives forever.
Now remember that there were hundreds of tests taken in '78 that indicated the shroud was not a painting, was not a photograph, it was not the kind of thing that one would expect to be a manufactured relic. And a wealth of other evidence gathered by our team and others indicated that the shroud was not a fake, that it was not a medieval painting, forgery, hoax, photograph, rubbing, etching, dust painting. These are all things that have been basically used to try and describe the shroud and what it might have been.
So the first thing that the scientists found, much to their surprise and delight, was that the shroud was not a fake. At least insofar as it was not created by any artistic means currently known to mankind. All of the research team's tests indicated that this was a genuine burial cloth. But then how could they be sure that it was actually the shroud of Jesus Christ and nobody else?
Obviously, the most important thing on the Shroud of Turin is the image of a man, front and back, ventral and dorsal, that appears along the full length of the cloth, with the ventral and dorsal images head to head with an appropriate space between them for the cloth to have been wrapped the way it was. Of course, the most important thing that we see, if we look at the ventral image, front image, is the man himself. And as he stands there, you can see his arms crossed before him. You can see his shoulders, although they were damaged in the fire of 1532 and there are holes and patches there now. You can then see the legs, the knees, the thighs, the calves, and even the feet on the ventral image. Now, when you look at the shroud a little closer, you'll also see a number of stains. When you look at the back side of the man, the dorsal side of the man, there you see something really amazing. There are a lot of markings across the back. Now, if you look closely, you'll find these extend all the way down past the buttocks to the back of the legs. And even on the front or ventral view, you'll find many of these because these are dumbbell-shaped markings, scourge wounds from a Roman flagrum. And a Roman flagrum had 3 thongs, leather usually, and at the end of each, a dumbbell-shaped lead or bone weight. And these are the marks that we see on the Shroud of Turin. We see dumbbell-shaped bruises, many of them that drew blood, actually broke the skin, and these cover the man's body, not just the back where they're predominant, but also many came around the front, because as the scourger moved a little closer, his whip would then wrap around the front of the body and leave markings on the front of the body as well. Now, if we look at the face of the man of the shroud, we see blood stains on the forehead. And if we go further, we see blood stains in the hair. If you look directly near his heart is the darkest blood stain, which we call the spear wound blood stain, that appears on the shroud. And interestingly enough, although you can't see it with the naked eye, when you photograph this area with UV fluorescence photography, you see a large serum stain, invisible to normal lighting, but visible there on the shroud with UV fluorescence photography. As you come down the shroud and look again at the hands, you'll see blood stains near the wrists of the man of the shroud. Now, this would be the crucifixion wound from where the hands were nailed to the cross, and unlike all medieval and Renaissance art, which always depicts the nailing of the hands through the palms themselves, this shows an exit wound further up the wrist and would have been the correct exit wound for the nailing through the wrists, because the Romans did this all the time, and they knew very well where to nail the hands so they wouldn't come loose, and in the middle of the palm is not the place to do that, closer to the wrist. So unlike all medieval and Renaissance art, the shroud shows it forensically accurate in the wrist. Now, if you come down and look at the feet, you'll also see at the feet bloodstains. Now, there's some argument as to whether both feet were individually nailed or whether one foot was nailed over the other. We cannot tell this from the bloodstains on the shroud. So it is impossible for us to make that conclusion, draw that conclusion from the Shroud of Turin.
The researchers discovered that if the shroud was a fake, it must have been created by an artist with a comprehensive understanding of the forensics of crucifixion. Something that virtually no other artists of that period have demonstrated. But there was more. So the bloodstains on the shroud clearly correspond to the wounds of a man who has been whipped and scourged before being crucified. Why is this important? Well, because the Romans didn't usually treat prisoners this way before an execution. But we know from the Gospels that Pontius Pilate was very uncomfortable with the idea of killing Jesus, who in his eyes had committed no crime.
So Pilate went outside to them and asked,
"What do you accuse this man of?"
We would not have brought him to you if he had not committed a crime.
Then you yourselves take him and try him according to your own law.
We are not allowed to put anyone to death.
This happened in order to make come true what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he would die. Then Pilate went back outside to the people and said to them,
I cannot find any reason to condemn him, but
So Pilate had Jesus whipped and scourged instead to try to pacify the Jewish authorities and save Jesus from execution.
The soldiers made a crown out of thorny branches and put it on his head. Then they put a purple robe on him and came to him and said, "Long live the King of the Jews." And they went up and slapped him.
look, I will bring him out here to you to let you see that I cannot find any reason to condemn him. Look, here is the man.
So Jesus was one of the few people to have been treated this way before being crucified, and therefore one of the few people to whom the Shroud of Turin could possibly belong.
You take him then and crucify him. I find no reason to condemn him.
We have a law that says he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God.
And what of the crown of thorns mentioned by the Gospels?
We have stains on the shroud, on the head, as if from a cap or crown of thorns. So once again, everything about the Shroud of Turin, all of the bloodstains, all of these markings are accurate to the gospel account of what was done to Jesus when he was scourged, beaten, and if you look at the man's face, once again I should mention, if you look at the face, look at the bruised cheekbones, one more swollen than the other, but both rather swollen. So this man had been beaten in the face, he had been scourged, he had been then crucified, and then he was speared.